First of all, I want to thank Herm Davis for inviting me here today to give this talk. We're going to cross the other side of the world to Normandy. I know today is the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. 72 years ago, there was the invasion of Normandy. Pearl Harbor was the beginning of the war. Normandy was the beginning of the end of the war. So I'd like to take you back to that day, D-Day. On D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, there was sailed from England to the Normandy coast, the greatest armada in history that would challenge Hitler's fortress Europe. Of the 5,000 ships and thousands of men involved, this is the story of the men in the first waves who would hit the beach of Normandy on D-Day. Casualties would be high, and thousands would not see the end of day. Fortress Europe would be breached by the heroism, the pain, and the supreme sacrifice of these men in the first waves. Through this breach, literally thousands of men would fiercely battle their way to Germany to victory in Europe. So sit back now as we set sail with Coast Guard Flotilla 10 aboard the USS LCI Landing Craft Infantry 492 into a beach called Omaha on the Normandy coast. This account of D-Day is given in the first person, but I wish to acknowledge the other officers and members of the crew who also sailed in the USS LCI 492 and witnessed and experienced the events in the following narrative. The invasion of Normandy on D-Day, Norbert Panning was our captain. K.R. Lavoie, our executive officer. Joseph Weber, our engineering officer. Stan Nelson from Andover, Minnesota, communication officer. Jack Claiborne, helmsman from Dyersburg, Tennessee. Marjorie Bowman from North Carolina. Tom Cooper, quartermaster from New Jersey. Robert Harris from Reedyville, Tennessee. Jim Reifsnyder, machinist mate from Pennsylvania. Russ Darling, radio man from Pennsylvania. Dan Picouch from upstate New York. Clarence Smith. Marty Grandinetti, our gunner's mate from Brooklyn. Ralph Weaver, Bill Moduno, singleman from Manchester, Connecticut. It was the end of May 1944. I reported aboard the USS LCI 492, a couple of weeks prior to D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. This was my first look at a landing craft, infantry. The LCIL is the smallest ocean-going ship in the Navy. She carried a crew of 24 enlisted men and 4 officers, with a troop carrying capacity of about 200 troops. She was 158 feet long with a 24-foot beam. With her flat bottom, she would discharge her troops directly on the beach. Troops would disembark by 2 ramps, more similar to gangplanks, which were lowered on each side of the ship, going forward directly down to the beach or into the water. The place was the seaport town of Weymouth on the southern coast of England. The LCI 492, along with other LCIs, the Flotilla 10, were tied up at a pier 3 or 4 abreast. The 492 was outboard, which necessitated we cross over 2 or 3 LCIs if we wanted to go onto the pier. Flotilla 10 was basically made up of Coast Guard LCIs. There was some Navy. The 492 was a Navy one. The Coast Guard LCIs were battle-hardened, having made landings at Sicily and Salerno. Their campaign ribbons and battle stars were painted on their con. The LCI 85 and 87 were 2 of them. Darkness fell about 11 p.m. or midnight, and about this time each night, prior to the invasion, general quarters would be sounded as the Germans mount their nightly bombing run on our port. The LCIs would immediately head out of the harbor for open water. My station was below deck, and I could hear the fire of our 20 millimeters and then explosions around us. After a while, we secured from general quarters and headed back to the pier. Fortunately, our ship suffered no casualties during these nightly raids, but it kept us from getting a good night's sleep. Securing general quarters was about 0400. On coming back to the ship one day, after a short daytime liberty, about 3 p.m. on the 3rd or 4th of June, I found a complete pier area crowded with soldiers. I had to work my way through the troops and their equipment to go on my LCI until I got to my ship. We were loaded with troops. To me, it seemed something big was about to happen, but my shipmates who had been on the LCI for some time assured me it was just another practice run, one of the many they had experienced over the past months. Late on the afternoon of June the 5th, it was announced there would be a Catholic Mass on the docks for all those who wanted to attend. At Mass time, the dock was packed with soldiers and sailors, so much so they spilled over onto the ships. I think every soldier and sailor on those ships was at Mass that afternoon. When the chaplain gave general absolution, I knew then this was not a sign for another practice run. At approximately 1700, special detail was set, and we got underway from our pier in Weymouth, England. As we left the harbor, we sailed past Portland Bill that jutted out into the English Channel. The weather was dull and gray, and the sea was rough, and we were taking spray over the bow. I looked out as we reached the open sea and saw ships and more ships, landing craft, patrol craft, troop transports, all breaking through the sea and all heading for France. At this time, we recall General Eisenhower's order of the day. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hope and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere go with you. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let's all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. Flotilla 10 had the LCI 87 leading the starboard column, the 492 leading the middle column, and the 408 leading the port column. The USS LCI 492, acting as headquarters ship, set their course for France. I remember on this trip that my stomach didn't feel the greatest, with these rough seas, the flat bottom, and most of all the smell of diesel fumes, since we must have had a following wind and the fumes kept blowing from the stern forward for the whole trip. After sailing all night, we arrived off the coast of Normandy early the morning of June the 6th, about 03:30, and began circling in this rendezvous area. June the 6th was a dull gray day with rough, choppy seas. About 0500, battleships Texas and Arkansas would unleash a tremendous barrage of firepower from their 14 and 12-inch guns. The cruisers Tuscaloosa, the Augusta, and the Quincy, and other ships would join them in firing at positions on the beach. I was stationed at the bow of the ship as we circled in the assault area, manning a radio and listening to communications when the first wave landed on Omaha about 0630. All I kept hearing on the radio were garbled words such as easy green, dog red, dog white, dog green, which later turned out to be the code names for the beach areas where the landings were taking place. Spray was coming over the bow so much the paper I was writing on was useless from getting wet. The LCIs of Flotilla 10, including the 492, we were assigned to land our troops on Omaha Beach. The ties of Normandy were tremendous length, since the Germans had all kinds of obstacles on the beach to stop, impale, or blow up the landing craft. We would land at low tide in order to avoid these obstacles. However, the problem was that the dead and wounded would be engulfed as the tide came in and would be floating around in the water, and this we witnessed. Our LCI 492 hit Omaha Beach a short time after the first wave. I remember while looking at the beach, there was much smoke and wreckage of equipment burning on the beach. William Muldoon, our signalman on the 492, was stationed above deck and witnessed firsthand the destruction and carnage. He watched 200 soldiers jump from our ship and run past the bodies of their fallen comrades to their almost certain death. Countless bodies of soldiers who had been cut down by the Germans lay near smoldering equipment. After discharging our troops, we backed off the beach and proceeded back to the assault area just off of Omaha. Coast Guard LCI 91 headed into Omaha Beach about 0740, carrying the alternate headquarters on the 116th Infantry. The 91 carefully maneuvered around stakes and beach obstacles and got 75 yards before unloading and grounding the vessel for troop disembarkation. The 91 moved, and as the load lightened and the tide rose until the tide swung the bow into stakes with tiller mines attached, one exploded, damaging the port bow. With some 60 troops still aboard, she retracted and sought out another beaching spot. The rams dropped into the water. As some officers led the way off, an artillery shell or rocket hit the crowded forward deck and set up a sheet of flame. Burning men jumped or fell off into the sea and tried to swim in under artillery and small arms fire. It is estimated that no personnel escaped from the number 1 compartment. The German 88s then, from shore batteries, blasted into the 91's well deck and exploded into fuel tanks below, engulfing the ship in flames. Enduring continual 88 millimeter and small arms fire, and without sufficient water power to fight the blaze, the order was given to reluctantly abandon ship. The landing craft 91 could be seen burning throughout the day. When the Coast Guard LCI 92 went in to land her 192 troops on Omaha, she found 91 in flames and landed in her lee to use her smoke as a screen. The 92 approached under heavy machine gun fire and rifle fire and German 88 shell fire. As it came into the beach, around 100 yards from shore, that hit a submerged mine that killed most of the soldiers in the forward compartment. The explosion on her port side rocked the ship, starting a fire and spraying the forward deck with fuel oil. The crew battled the flames, then a shell from the German batteries on shore exploded aboard. Aground, she started to unload troops under heavy machine gun and rifle fire, and after all those who were not killed on the explosion below decks were ashore, an attempt was made to retract, but the fire was intense, and gaining an order was given to abandon ship. Coast Guard LCI 85 approached Omaha Beach. The crew heard repeated thuds against the ship's hull, made by wood stakes covering the beach like a man-made forest. No clear channel existed where the commanding officer's charts indicated there would be, so he ordered the landing craft straight through the obstacles that had been covered by the incoming tide. The bow touched bottom, and the ship ground to a halt. A mine exploded and ripped a gaping hole in the forward compartments, and German batteries pummeled the LCI numerous times. Many of the troops on board were torn to pieces before they were ever got off the ship. Those who were still able to disembark could not because the explosion had destroyed the vessel's landing ramps. The burning LCI backed off the beach as the crew fought the fires in the forward compartments. The ship then began to list as water poured in through the shell holes. The 85 made her way back to the Coast Guard manned attack transport, the USS Samuel Chase, with some 15 dead and 30 wounded still aboard. They offloaded these onto the Chase, and before the crew had to abandon their ship, the waters of Normandy slowly washed over the blood-stained decks of the LCI 85, settled deeper into the sea. Slowly it capsized, turned the stern skyward, and sank. The LCI 85 was one of the Coast Guard named ships that participated in the landings in France on June the 6th, 1944, a day that would prove to be one of the bloodiest in the Coast Guard's long history. By the grace of God, the LCI 492 survived the landings. Of the LCIs of Flotilla 10 that had landed in Omaha, 4 were lost and 3 were extensively damaged. All suffered casualties of crew and troops. It was hard to believe. A little more than 12 hours earlier, I had attended Mass and received absolution with the troops and crews of these LCIs on the pier in Weymouth, England. One sight that all tin can sailors can take pride in was the way these destroyers swept in close to Omaha Beach and delivered gunfire in the German positions and dueled with them from the late morning into the afternoon. These destroyers were called in to furnish the only artillery support the infantry got on Omaha Beach. Sometime during the day, German planes came over from out of nowhere and flew so close over us you could almost touch them. They didn't fire or drop anything on us, and they were gone in an instant. Also, as the day progressed, we started seeing the results of the battle on the beach. The rescue and recovery of the wounded and dead was assigned to the Coast Guard, who manned their 83-footers. These small wooden crafts were all over in these rough seas doing their work. We also picked up survivors and dead from a life raft from a British destroyer that had hit a mine. We also circled an LST, which was also floating bow up. Survivors had probably been picked up by another ship. As the day drew to a close and darkness fell, two things remained to be mentioned. One was the German E-boats. These boats, similar to our PT boats, would infiltrate the invasion fleet and torpedo our ships. Secondly, this first night, the Germans mounted an air raid on the invasion fleet. Never in my life, and probably will never see, a display of firepower that was delivered by 5,000 ships. It was like 1,000 Fourth of Julys rolled into one. Tracers filled the skies that it looked like the curtain of fire. So much was thrown up in the air that you could hear pieces of metal hit the deck as they fell from the sky. This display of firepower was a fitting end of D-Day. The LCI 492 ended up at the end of D-Day. We were in good shape. She was still afloat, but our quartermaster had been slightly wounded. Back in the United States, on news of the invasion, church bells rang across the United States and Canada, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Gulf Coast, not in triumph or celebration, but as a solemn reminder of national unity and a call to formal prayer. Special services were held in every church and synagogue in the land, and pews were jammed with worshipers. At the end of the day, back in the United States, families listened to the radio as President Franklin Roosevelt united all America in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor. These men are lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They yearn but at the end of battle for the return to the haven and home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I have something for you here.
Uh-huh.
Yep. On behalf of our Student Veteran Association, Peter, we'd like to offer you this word of appreciation. Thank you for your service, and thank you for participating. We certainly appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. We'll get this to you.